record. Okay, well, I'm doing this over again one more time because I skipped a couple slides on accident. So yeah, and now that I figured out how to do this, it should be easy. So Mrs. McKenna, so beginning in the 2000s, banks created new ways. So the first one, this is the slide that I skipped actually. So let's take a look at how the current mortgage system works. So beginning in the 2000s, banks created new ways of financing that decreased risk, allowing them to lend money to people like minorities and poor whites who previously could not have gotten a loan to buy a house due to insufficient capital. So basically what this means here is that prior to the 2000s, you needed to make a down payment. This was normally like 15% or something like that, 15 to 20% down payment. However, with this, you can have much lower down payments, like 3% down payments, much lower. And the banks were able to do this because they created um, uh, systems that decrease the risk for low by making less payments, by spreading the payments out. They could decrease the risk. Now, it's also true that these things are still risky. This is still more risky than, say, having a 15% down payment, because what a down payment does is it's basically an insurance policy that if everything falls through, the bank and you still get something out of it. So this is still more risky, but and it's also true that unfortunately these practices were not very regulated, causing banks to give bad people to ones who could not possibly repay them. I say bad because some of the people who got houses, like, they couldn't possibly repay them, and it was irresponsible of the banks to give them these loans. It's also true that some banks gave people loans that they knew they definitely couldn't repay, or they used very nefarious loans like the adjusted rate interest loan that I mentioned before. So the reason so many people lost their homes during the 2008 recession was because many had been given bad loans they could not possibly repay. We covered that in the last slide. I'm just going over it. So the people who had these mortgages couldn't possibly repay them because of the adjusted rate interest loan, which is nefarious. We didn't have the capital. So when the bank said to call back these loans, the people couldn't repay them. Now, it's the bank's fault though, because they were the ones responsible. They were the ones yeah, but I mean, I shouldn't have the resume recording. So it was the bank's fault because the most of the banks gave people these loans that they said they weren't risky, like they were little to no risk. But as I covered in the last slide, these loans were more risky than normal loans, and if you have something like an adjusted rate interest loan, it's very risky. So it's really the bank's fault. So could the government have done anything to avoid the housing bubble or subprime mortgage crisis? I mean, well, what did they do? So the federal government built out the big banks whose bad loans and just general nefarious practices caused the homeowners to lose their homes. They built out the big banks and also the corporations, but the homeowners who were the most negatively affected were not built out. Now, I should mention there were programs, but they were very complicated programs to enter. I mean, you normally had to have some capital. Basically, the homeowners on the low end of the spectrum had no chance of getting these programs. And I'd say even the homeowners in like the middle spectrum, a lot of them couldn't really get them either. So I would, so basically, although the government basically couldn't have avoided this crisis. At least the government at the time, because of the deregulation of the financial system during the Bush and Clinton administrations. It's the deregulation of the financial system and the fact that the housing markets were not regulated that basically caused the crisis in the first place. And if and these couldn't have been avoided. The only way to avoid them would have been not to deregulate. So I will also note here that, of course, the corporations and the big banks spend $2.7 billion toward a deregulation campaign in the 90s and 2000s. Yeah. So what would Marx think of all this? Well, Marx would, of course, note the interlinkage between the government and the institutions and the banks and the corporations and the big banks. In our capitalist system, everything is meshed together. So this is what you have to understand. For good and for ill, of course, Marx would think it was bad, but and that goes without saying. He would not find it surprising that, in his words, a bourgeois capitalist government, and by his words, I mean, he didn't actually say this, but this is probably what he would say, a bourgeois capitalist government would bail out the banks whose illegal or risky practices caused the subprime mortgage crisis or housing bubble in the first place, but not the homeowners that were the most negatively affected by the crisis. Of course, Marx would also note that once homeowners became renters, these same big banks who gave them bad loans tended to treat them much worse than the average landlord would treat his renter. And part of the reason for this is that the big banks don't have a connection with people on a daily basis. Even most landlords have some kind of interaction with their tenants. I mean, at least like once a month when they're paying bills or whatever. They may even know the tenants personally. That means that, I mean, you're not, at least some landlords will not just throw people out on the street. Of course, it happens very often, but that is much worse with the big banks. So then no connection at all. So they don't care, Finally, he would also agree that he would also think that the crisis would just happen again as long as the big banks and government services, as long as the government serves the interest of the big banks and the corporations rather than the people. So, and there you have my cited material. This is the stuff. This is just where I got the images that I used in this presentation from. So,